Why, it's the sheriff. Seems you have not shaved this morning.
Curses, Robin. Once again you made a fool of me and my wicked schemes.
In the lawless world of the Middle Ages, a poor man's only hope of justice lay with those bold men living lives of freedom in the forest, the legendary outlaws of medieval England.
Heroes who bestrode the greenwood, fearlessly, wearing only tights and little short tunics that hardly covered their bottoms. The medieval outlaw has come to represent freedom and justice for the common man. But were there really outlaws like Robin Hood in medieval England? And if not, why do we think there were? And another thing, was the law so out of reach for ordinary people? And did the forest really represent freedom? And of course, the key question, did outlaws never wear trousers?
My investigation into medieval law and order starts on the trail of a real-life 14th century outlaw gang in the tranquil village of T in Rutland.
Sweet, isn't it? One afternoon in 1340, however, the peace and quiet of this little village was shattered by a dramatic shootout.
A group of armed men laid siege to this church. After a ferocious battle, the rector, whose place of worship it had been for 20 years, was dragged outside into the street and beheaded.
But the situation wasn't quite what it might seem. The gang of armed men who slew the man of God weren't the outlaws. They were supposed to represent law and order. It was the rector who was the outlaw. His name was Richard Folville, and he was a member of that notorious gang of outlaws, the Folvilles.
A generation after their deaths, the Folvilles were celebrated as the kind of outlaws who righted wrongs. One chronicle tells how they took the law into their own hands and rode out to right injustice by force of arms. Folville's laws became a synonym for justified robbery. So were the Folvilles the real-life Robin Hoods? Well, it would be nice if they were, but I'm afraid not. The Folvilles were aristocratic brothers whose father was the lord of the manor of Ashby Folville. But why were the sons of nobility turning to crime?
When old John de Folville died in 1310, he left his entire estate to his eldest son, which is what he did in those days. The younger sons were supposed to go into the church or join the army. In the Folvilles' case, however, there were another 6 brothers, enough to take a third alternative: form a gang and embark on a life of crime. According to local legend, this stone with its cross marks the spot where the Folvilles began their career as outlaws, for it was here that they helped murder a local bigwig. But you couldn't become an outlaw just like that. There were various requirements the Folvilles would have had to fulfill. The chief qualification for becoming an outlaw was failure to turn up for trial on 3 successive occasions. The Folvilles passed this test with flying colours.
It meant that from now on they could practice as fully qualified outlaws, pursuing their trade of assault and robbery, extortion and kidnapping to fill their own pockets. And they weren't the only gangs of upper-crust gentlemen who terrorised the country. There was Sir William Chettleton's gang in Shropshire, Sir Gilbert Middleton's in Durham, and Sir Henry Leyburn's in Kent, not to mention the Cotterell gang, who sometimes joined forces with the Folvilles.
These aristocratic gangs weren't robbing from the rich to give to the poor. They were career criminals with a network of spies and informers, and with political connections.
John Bromyard, the Dominican friar and preacher, complained that England was more crime-ridden than any other country, mainly because of the gentry turning to crime or employing thugs to do their robbing for them. So if the outlaws actually were the bad guys, where does that leave their traditional foe, the sheriff? The wicked sheriff.
Well done! You're finally learning how to treat these animals.
Then maybe I'll get a...
Here in Sherwood Forest, the old melodrama is still being played out, to the delight of audiences.
Isn't he tall? Don't you think he's tall?
Now, undoubtedly, there were sheriffs who abused their power. One sheriff of Nottingham, for example, even ran a mafia-style operation in the 14th century, which involved his wife, clerk, and chaplain. But wicked sheriffs were the exception rather than the rule.
There.
I'm disappointed to have to tell you that the vast majority of sheriffs were pen-pushing bureaucrats, overloaded with work and constantly grappling with a stream of writs from litigious peasants or orders from central government. They were the one-man county councils of their day.
We'll teach him some manners.
Torturing peasants and oppressing the poor? Most sheriffs were too busy organising the Home Guard or tracking down regional cheeses for the royal household or a decent set of hunting dogs for the king.
We like to think of this story of the outlaw as a black and white tale of goodies and baddies. The reality was less clear-cut. During the Middle Ages, the very notion of what an outlaw was changed dramatically, and so did the legal system the outlaws sought to avoid.
In Anglo-Saxon England, people had been accustomed to administering the law themselves. It was sort of neighbourhood watch, but with this big difference, you could make money out of it. You see, the Anglo-Saxons weren't particularly bothered about punishments. What interested them was victim compensation, and there was a strict tariff.
If the nose be mutilated, 6 shillings. If an ear be struck off, 12 shillings. 50 shillings for an eye, 50 shillings for a foot, and 10 shillings for the big toe. For each of the 4 front teeth, 6 shillings. For the tooth which stands next to them, 4 shillings. For that which stands next to that, 3 shillings. And then afterwards, for each a shilling. Being punched in the face could mean a windfall.
This has to be my lucky day.
Back then, to be declared an outlaw was a fearful thing indeed.
People then lived in small, self-regulating communities, and to be excluded was like being sent into exile. Worse, an outlaw was a wolf's head, someone who could be killed on sight. They were forced to live a life on the run, outside normal society.
But in 1066, England became an occupied nation. A legal system that depended on the cooperation of the conquered with their conquerors was simply not going to work. So the Normans introduced certain legal refinements, such as collective punishment and trial by battle.
Now, a trial by battle may conjure up images of noble duels fought at dawn between expert swordsmen, but the reality was often a lot more mundane, if not downright comical. Take, for example, the case of Thomas Whitehorn and James Fisher. Well, they certainly met at dawn, but the weapons the authorities provided them with were not swords. Each was given a ram's horn. Well, they did their best to kill each other with these, but after a few blows, the ram's horns broke, and the pair were reduced to trying to bite each other to death. Here's a contemporary account of what went on. Whitehorn got Fisher on the ground and then bit him by the member, causing him to cry out. But Fisher bounced back, got his teeth around Whitehorn's nose and poked his thumb into his eye. Well, Whitehorn cried for mercy, confessed all, and was duly hanged. Fisher, for reasons best known to himself, left town and became a hermit.
If that was Norman justice, the Normans could keep it. And that's what many Anglo-Saxons seem to think. And they chose to be outlawed rather than stand trial. By 1150, the whole legal system had collapsed. So Henry II totally reinvented it, developing a legal process unique to England, which put power back in the hands of the local community. Trial by jury, but not as we know it.
Medieval jurors weren't chosen for their impartiality, but on the contrary, they were chosen because they knew the people involved in the case. In 1344, for example, one of the Folvilles, Alice, was acquitted in the King's Bench by a jury specially imported from here, her home village of Tea.
England wasn't lawless, it was the reverse. There were too many laws governing every little detail of life. But people quickly learned how to use the law to their advantage. The common man had no need for Robin Hood to fight his corner. He had lawyers to do it for him. And the records of these proceedings, some 700 years old, make fascinating reading.
How would you compare people's access to the law in the Middle Ages with people today?
They were extremely litigious. I mean, you think of modern-day America, and medieval society was using the law and aware of the law.
Was the law expensive? Did it cost a lot?
For poor people, there was a sort of primitive form of legal aid. You could also retain a lawyer by giving him goods in kind. We have a document here which shows us that this particular person retained an attorney, paying him in fromage et beurre, cheese and butter.
Cheese and butter. I'll try that nowadays, you might get a short shrift.
The royal court was the medieval equivalent of the Old Bailey. No matter how small the case, they're all solemnly recorded in meticulous detail.
This is the rolls of the Court of Common Pleas, all the cases for the year in that court in London. This particular one's fairly long and involved. Richard Orring from Exeter has brought this case all the way to London, and he alleges that the defendant, Henry Hull, has used force and violence, vi et armis. He came into his garden with swords, bows and arrows. You can imagine the picture of this.
It's a dramatic scene.
Yes,
Yeah.
destroyed his grass, and when it boils down to it, he'd lopped off some branches and basically gone round and collected his hedge clippings.
So it's a dispute about hedge clippings.
It is, yes.
With people rushing to court to sue each other over hedge clippings, more and more people were failing to turn up for trial, and consequently being outlawed for non-attendance. By the mid-14th century, almost everybody seems to get outlawed at some point in their lives. It was no big deal. It was a bit like having your credit card refused.
As the threat of being outlawed diminished, it became harder to force people to stand trial. That's why places like this were created. Prison. Not as a place of punishment, mind you, but as a means to force people to stand trial.
Medieval prisons were privately owned and could be nice little earners. This one was built and owned by the Archbishop of York, and he made a packet out of it.
Open for business in 1330, the prison at Hexham in Northumberland was the first purpose-built prison in England.
Believe it or not, you had to pay to get into prison as well as pay to get out. Jailers brewed their own beer and sold it to the inmates, who also had to pay for their bedding, their food, their fuel and their lighting. Prisoners without money were allowed out onto the streets to beg. Anything, as long as the Archbishop got his cash.
Here at